Good morning, APUSH. I am so sorry that I'm not there to be with you guys today as we talk about one of my favorite lectures. I know I say that every single time, but this is a really great lecture to get us started on basically the beginning of the modern era that we're going to be finishing up with our APUSH materials before the AP exam, which is again just a couple months away. Today, we are going to be having a lecture on the Cold War. And we are specifically going to be looking at two pieces, the Cold War abroad, so relationships between the United States and other countries, and the Cold War at home, what is happening within the United States during this 15-year period. I have pre-recorded this lecture, so you are now with a teacher who is either playing this video or you're watching independently. Please make sure that you utilize pausing and filling in the notes as you can. As a reminder, follow the slides with the top smaller yellow writing. Those are going to be the key terms that you want to make sure you are paying attention for in my lecture as you fill in the notes. If you have any questions or concerns, my email and phone number are always open and available, and tomorrow I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. Awesome, and let's get started with the Cold War. Again, this first part of the lecture is going to be rooted in the Cold War abroad from 1945 to 1960. And we are going to start in 1945. 1945 was a critical year in terms of the end of World War II and the start to the Cold War. As we know, the United States and the USSR were allies during World War II, but they definitely weren't friends. The wartime cooperation between the USSR and the American government was a temporary arrangement. There was a history of bad feelings between between these two countries ever since the Russian Revolution of 1917. During the Russian Revolution, the US supported anti-communists and didn't even recognize the Soviet Union as a legal government until 1933. These actions caused considerable resentment in the Soviet Union. The USSR disagreed with the Allies over wartime strategy and post-war plans during World War II. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin wanted the invasion of Western Europe sooner. As the end of the war approached, relations between the communist Soviet Union and the two Western democracies grew increasingly tense. Towards the end of World War II, the Allied leaders, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the center, Winston Churchill on the left, and Joseph Stalin on the right, met at the Yalta Conference to determine the post-war plans. One key part of the Yalta Conference that it was agreed upon was the United Nations, which would be a new international peacekeeping organization. Members would try to settle their differences peacefully and promote justice and cooperation in solving global conflicts. Now we're going to look and see what happens after the end of World War II. The formation of the United Nations was a unique area of common ground and cooperation. Elsewhere, the world was becoming divided. At the end of World War II, the Allies decided to split Germany up into occupation zones. The West was divided into democratically controlled zones controlled by the American government, France, and Britain, while the East was controlled by the communist Soviets. Over time, the eastern half developed into a communist state. And while the Soviets viewed a weak Germany as necessary for their security, the Democratic Allies believed that they needed to develop a strong, economically prosperous Germany. And this was critical for European stability. In 1946, distrust grew as the Soviet forces remained in occupation of many Central and Eastern European countries. Elections were held, but they were manipulated in favor of communist candidates. By 1948, communist dictators loyal to Moscow came to power in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Collectively, these are known as the satellite states that the Soviets viewed as necessary buffer against any future aggression. This expansion led Winston Churchill to declare that there was an iron curtain across the continent and required the partnership of Western democracies to stop the spread of communism. And as you can see in that black line, those black lines are that iron curtain that Winston Churchill is discussing. Now we're going to look at the popular theory of stopping communism known as containment. In response to the Soviet and communist expansion, President Truman and the American government adopted a foreign policy called containment. The containment policy dictated that the United States would attempt to contain communism wherever it existed and prevent future expansion. The United States first implemented the containment policy in response to threats in Greece and Turkey. In what became known as the Truman Doctrine, the president asked Congress for $400 million in economic and military aid to assist the free people of Greece and Turkey from totalitarian regimes. Later that same year, in June 1947, the US began a new economic plan in response to the instability of Europe. This program is called the Marshall Plan, which approved billions of dollars in economic aid to the countries of Western Europe for the next 4 years. And it worked exactly as anticipated. By the 1950s, Western Europe had achieved sustained economic growth and stability, ending any real threat of communism spreading there. But there was a major crisis in 1948 in Berlin. The Soviet Union cut off all access to the city, including the western half that was controlled by the Democratic Allies. And the United States ordered a massive campaign known as the Berlin Airlift, which flew supplies into Berlin. Round-the-clock shipments arrived in Berlin to supply the people of West Berlin until the Soviets ended the blockade in 1949. This crisis would lead to the creation of two Germanys. The first is the Federal Republic of Germany, also known as Western Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, Eastern Germany. Now let's look at the security that they tried to have abroad at this time. As a part of the policy to modernize its military in 1947, the American government established the National Security Act, accomplishing three main things. It created the Department of Defense as a centralized place for all branches of the military. It created the National Security Council to make foreign policy during the Cold War, and it created the CIA to gather information on foreign governments. In 1949, Truman broke with established US foreign policy, going all the way back to Washington's farewell address, by recommending that the United States join a military defense pact. The Senate quickly approved, and together the US, Canada, and 10 European nations joined to form NATO, also known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was formed as a military alliance for defense using US troops in Europe as a deterrence against Soviet aggression. Member nations in NATO pledged to help each other if attacked in a principle known as collective security. The Soviet Union responded with an organization of its own called the Warsaw Pact. fall of that same year, in 1949, the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb. This began an arms race between the United States and Soviet Union to develop a stronger and more powerful nuclear weapon. Also, by the end of 1949, all of China had fallen to communist rule, which many Americans viewed as a failure of Truman's policy. Now we're going to transition and look at the Korean War, which is a part of the Cold War. The success of the American government's containment policy in Europe did not carry over into Asia. The colonialism of the past 2 centuries had crumbled after World War II, leaving resistance to Western or US influence in countries around the globe. After World War II, Korea had been divided in half, similar to Germany, along the 38th parallel, which is where the border began. In 1950, the communist North invaded into the democratic South. The US and the United Nations sprang into action to help South Korea and stop just short of declaring war. The war was stalemated along that 38th parallel, and peace talks began in 1951. 2.5 million people died in this conflict, including 54,000 Americans. The war dragged into the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower until 1953, when an armistice was signed. Armistice is an end to fighting, but not a permanent peace treaty. The war was used as an example of the success of the containment policy and used to justify further expansion of this policy. Next, we're going to see how communism continues in other areas. As elsewhere in the world, an international force divided Vietnam between a communist North and a democratic South. In July of 1953, President Eisenhower fulfilled a campaign promise to end the Korean War, while at the same time providing military support elsewhere. The United States supported France, which was trying to maintain control over some of its colonies in Vietnam. Eisenhower justified this through something he called the Domino Theory, and the Domino Theory is very important. The Domino Theory is the belief that if one country fell to communism, then others would follow in its place. In the Middle East, the United States continued and expanded its Cold War policies. Under a new Eisenhower doctrine, the United States pledged to send economic and military aid to any Middle Eastern country threatened by communism. Similarly, in Latin America, the American government worked to support pro-American governments and suppress communist influences. Most alarming, though, was the loss of Cuba to communism. Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed dictator in 1959, and this meant there was a communist nation only 90 miles off the shore of Florida. Now that we have an idea of what is happening in the Cold War abroad, we're now going to see what kind of influence this has on the American public. And first, let's consider where we are starting in 1945 in a post-World War II America. At home after World War II, society is changing. One major reason for this was the passage of the GI Bill by the American government. The GI Bill provided support for veterans returning home after war, and over 2 million used the government funding to attend college. Veterans also received $16 billion in low-interest government-backed loans to buy houses and farms or start businesses. Simultaneously, another transformation was taking place, the baby boom. An explosion of marriages and births, a result of confidence in post-World War II America, led to 50 million babies entering the United States population between 1945 and 1960. Because of the returning veterans and baby boom, Americans needed housing more than ever. Suburban housing expanded, and Americans flocked out of cities into communities like Levittown. Levittown was a project of 17,000 mass-produced, low-price homes in Long Island, New York. In a single generation, more middle-class Americans lived in the suburbs than the cities, leaving many older cities increasingly poor and racially divided in the 1960s. Many of these Americans looking for a warmer climate, lower taxes, and economic opportunity migrated to the Sun Belt states, from Florida to California. This was also helped by the Highway Act signed by President Eisenhower in 1956, which connected cities and allowed Americans to live in the suburbs and commute to the cities by the millions. Now we are going to look at Truman's domestic policies. Truman's first priority was what we call reconversion, the social and economic transition from wartime to peacetime. Economically, Truman struggled. Inflation soared to 25%, and millions of workers went on strike, demanding that their wages meet that inflation. And socially, Truman recognized that as president, he had to make the American government take action on civil rights. Truman formed the biracial Committee on Civil Rights in 1946 to address concerns of African Americans. He banned discrimination in the hiring of federal employees and ordered an end to the segregation and discrimination in the armed forces. Southern Democrats blocked other proposals aimed at challenging race discrimination and bringing about equality. Instead, the Republican Congress focused its efforts on passing tax cuts for its upper income Americans, which were then vetoed by Truman. Truman passed the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, which severely weakened labor unions. And they also ratified the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment was signed in 1951 and limited the presidents to 2 terms. Truman won re-election in 1948, and then he created a policy known as the Fair Deal, a set of proposals for post-war economic improvement. However, he got a lot of political opposition from either conservative Democrats and Republicans. Although some measures passed, like a slight increase on minimum wage, many were rejected by Congress. Now we're going to start to look at the culture of what is happening in the United States as all of this is happening. During the 1940s, a fear of communist spies created a climate of suspicion in the United States, in what we call the Second Red Scare. Truman established a federal employee loyalty program in 1947 called the Loyalty Review Board, checking the backgrounds of all new and existing federal employees in the American government. Thousands of officials either resigned or lost their jobs. Over Truman's veto, Congress passed the Mccarran Internal Security Act in 1950, which punished communist supporters and created detention camps for subversives. The House of Representatives reactivated the House of Representatives reactivated HUAC, which stands for the House of Un-American Activities Committee. House Un-American Activities Committee, which began investigating government officials and even Hollywood personalities who the committee claimed had communist leanings. One group, known as the Hollywood 10, refused to answer HUAC's questions, and they were cited for contempt in Congress and imprisoned. Hollywood studios compiled a blacklist, a list circulated to employers naming persons who should not be hired. Blacklisted individuals came from all sections of the industry and included anyone who seemed subversive. Two famous spy cases in the late 1940s and early 1950s reinforced fears that the Soviet spies in the United States were sharing American secrets with foreign communists. Alger Hiss, a government official in the State Department, was accused of communist activity and convicted of perjury. You also have Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were convicted in 1953 of treason for supposedly giving atomic secrets to the Russians, and they were executed. One of the leaders of this anti-communist effort is Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was a Republican senator up for re-election in Wisconsin. He raised the specter of communist conspiracies within the United States. McCarthy produced a list of 205 names of presumed communist supporting employees in the American government. McCarthy quickly received nationwide attention and rode the wave of accusations to keep attention on himself and discredit the Truman administration. Although McCarthy's accusations were usually baseless and unprovable, few were willing to risk their reputations by speaking out against him. In early 1954, McCarthyism, the name given to McCarthy's crusade, reached the army. Televised hearings showed McCarthy's ability to bully millions of Americans, and supporters rapidly turned against him. The Senate formally condemned him for his actions. McCarthy was irrelevant after his censure and died 3 years later, but he severely damaged American trust in its government, institutions, and fellow citizens. As all of this was happening, America realized that they wanted a change in the government. And in 1952, they voted for former General Dwight D. Eisenhower for president. Eisenhower advocated a program of modern republicanism, which was an approach to government involving conservative economic policies, but liberal social policies. He accepted the New Deal as a modern reality and even extended some of its programs. He expanded Social Security to 10 million more Americans. He raised the minimum wage, and he built additional housing. Like many Republicans, his economic priorities included cutting spending, reducing taxes, and balancing the budget. Eisenhower also advocated for a policy of Brinkmanship. This policy called for a more aggressive stance against the Soviet Union by building up nuclear weapons and threatening to use them. With each side threatening massive retaliation, it kept the two superpowers from fighting one another directly, which was known as mutually assured destruction. If one of them sent an atomic bomb, it was sure that the entire world would end. Eisenhower was tested, though, in 1957 when the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite into space. American schools became the target of the failures of US technology and innovation. So, in response, Congress passed the National Defense and Education Act, giving money to math, science, and foreign language programs. And a year later, in 1958, Congress creates NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, as a way to build up US efforts to build missiles and explore space. Now we are going to look at what is happening in 1950s culture. Among the white suburbanites, the 1950s were marked by similarities in social norms. By the 1950s, television suddenly became the center of family life in millions of American homes. Television programming was dominated by 3 networks who all created a bland menu of comedy, westerns, quiz shows, and sports. Televisions presented a common culture to Americans across the nation: white, middle class, and suburban. Using television, radio, and magazines, aggressive advertising by name brands promoted common material wants. And the introduction of suburban shopping malls and plastic credit cards gave consumers quick access to these products. We start to see the creation of franchise fast food restaurants appearing along roadsides as the nation turned away from mom and pop stores. Cars became a part of American culture and began to be replaced every 2 or 3 years. All this was happening while Cold War fears abroad and at home caused many Americans to value security over adventure, and they gladly accepted conformity as a price for stability and economic success. We also see the expansion of organized religion after World War II, and thousands of new churches and synagogues are built. The combination of the baby boom and running a home in the suburbs made homemaking a full-time job for millions of American women. The traditional view of a woman's role as the homemaker and mother was reaffirmed in mass media. Although more women eventually entered the workforce, ultimately female workers were seen by men primarily as mothers and wives, and definitely received lower wages. However, this culture of the 1920s did get some pushback. Some critiqued this new popular culture of 1950s. Harvard sociologist David Reisman criticized Americans for being other-directed conformists in his book, The Lonely Crowd. In The Affluent Society, published in 1958, John Kenneth Galbraith wrote about wealthy Americans' failures to address the needs to increase social spending for the common good. His ideas actually will influence future policies of JFK and Lyndon Johnson. Popular novelists of the 1950s like J.D. Salinger wrote about individual struggles against conformity. We also see music capture this rebellious spirit. Rock and roll, a style of music based on Black rhythm and blues, also popularized by Elvis, became really popular amongst teenagers in the 1950s. Popular with both Black and white teenagers, rock and roll threatened those who were comfortable with racial segregation. We also see a group of rebellious writers and intellectuals made up of the Beat generation of the 1950s. Led by Jack Kerouac, His last name is spelled Kerouac. They advocated for spontaneity, open sexuality, drug use, and rebellion against societal standards. However, as we know, there was a growing movement for racial equality. And soon the civil rights movement would sweep the nation in the years to come, and that will be the topic of our next lecture. Thank you guys for following along with the video. Please make sure you submit photos of your notes. Photos will be 50% of today's classwork grade. The other 50% will be on your exit ticket, so please make sure you turn in both of these things by 6 p.m. As always, please reach out if you have any questions, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.